Well, good afternoon. Nice to see you all. Nice to be joining you here for this workshop, and appreciate you're all hanging in there for the opportunity for me to share our experience and lessons from San Francisco. So let's give me there we go. Just a little bit of context background. You're all familiar with San Francisco. Probably many visited. But we are I like to think of ourselves as more of an international city than a U.S. city, as we are a very dense and multicultural population. We have we're in a very dense peninsula of about 50 square miles or 80 square kilometers. About 850,000 people, residents live there. But then during the daytime, we have hundreds of thousands that come in to work. 16 million tourists a year, so we're over a million during the daytime. And this just gives you an idea of density. The darker colors are more dense. And here you see we've got up to 50 to 100,000 people per square mile. And then this shows you that we have quite a multicultural population. The colors in red are countries from Asia, with those after English, Chinese being the second most common language, Cantonese in terms of spoken, then Spanish, but then Vietnamese and Russian and Tagalog and many different languages. Literally about half the population speaks a different language at home. So as a policy framework, we have a policy of going towards zero waste, which is a real aspirational, visionary goal. And that means zero waste to landfill and zero waste to incineration. As both landfill and incineration, we consider disposal technologies. They're a linear solution. And if we think of waste management, if it ends on a linear process, then we have to go back to the beginning to replace the products that we are throwing away. And when I got this policy adopted back in 2002, I was telling our policymakers, if we think about every time we're throwing something away to replace that product, the making of that product with the resource extraction and manufacturing is creating on average 70 times the amount of waste that we are discarding. So it's important that we moved from an unsustainable linear to a circular economy, and promoting the highest best use of the resources that we're discarding and encouraging consumer and producer responsibility. So I'm making the pivot to talk about recycling, but I want to just give a little bit of acknowledgement to the hierarchy that we've been talking about here on the conference, a lot about source reduction and feeding people. And this is something that we are also doing. So our recycling is happening in the context of promoting source reduction as much as we can. We have campaigns about loving food and reducing food waste to consumers and working with commercial establishments. And we also have campaigns where we've worked with the food banks. So if you see over there the picture, that's a refrigerated truck. We've given grants for the food bank to buy refrigerated trucks, pay full-time staff, buy large-scale refrigerators and freezers and forklifts for their large warehouse. And this has allowed them to recover thousands of tons of food out of San Francisco. And then the food that they are sorting through, some of that clean sorted food along with other food processing waste can be used for animal feed. So we have farmers from north of San Francisco that come down and pick up sorted produce or tofu residuals or brewery grains and feed it to animals. So feeding animals is the next highest best use. We have industrial uses like for fats, oils, and grease being rendered into animal products or being made into other products like biodiesel. And then composting. But I agree with Sarah from ReFed. I don't know if Sarah is still here, but when she said that if you look at all of food, that can really handle about 75%. And my guess would be, I don't have a figure of how much we're reducing source reduction. It's hard to measure. But on feeding people, we're probably around 2 to 2.5% of all our food is being recovered that way. Pretty good. Feeding animals, probably around 10%. And then what we're doing, that's feeding animals industrial uses. And composting, we're probably around 60%. So I think we've reached a point where we're recovering about 3/4 of all the food scraps in the city. So let me illustrate how we're doing that. I'm now going to focus on the composting part, as that's my main mission here, and what we haven't heard too much except for the great example Rosario. So our approach is developing comprehensive programs, creating the infrastructure, creating the outreach, providing incentives, then creating mandates and enforcing those mandates. So this is being done in partnership with private service companies. So it's nice, as working for the city of San Francisco, I don't have to directly manage operations in a fleet of trucks and drivers. I get to help focus on developing policy, facilitating, coordinating, regulating, and we have the service providers that do the heavy lifting. So here is our signature three-stream program, and this is a program that has been in place now for over 15 years, and it was a result of several years of doing pilot programs where we tested out different types of containers and different types of trucks, different combinations of material, starting out with just doing vegetative food because that's what we had permitted facilities for, and eventually being able to do all food scraps. So this is an example of the communication signage that we use. Because of our multilingual population, we use mostly pictures, and people using pictures and being color-coded is really the easiest way to communicate. People don't want to read if they don't have to, so when they glance, they see the picture of what they're supposed to do, they match the color, and green for putting their food scraps, all food scraps, into the container, along with food-soiled paper fibers and containers, along with plant debris, recycling, all recycling together, bottles, cans, and paper, and then what's not compostable and what's not recyclable ends up in our black bin or landfill bin. So to illustrate what's going into the composting, all types of food scraps, and we say we don't want any plastic, but that looks like a plastic bag, doesn't it? And it is, but it's a compostable plastic bag. And as you probably know, there are compostable products on the market that can be made out of plastic. This one example is BioBag. The resin's manufactured in Italy. Used to be made out of cornstarch and now mostly out of non-food bio-based material. But there are a variety of options, and we require that they meet third-party certification for compostability. So we make sure that it composts rapidly in the process. And then other food soil products and plants. So when we rolled the program out, we started with single-family households, that previous picture you saw on the street. But then after doing that successfully, getting to all 140+ thousand households, we moved to multifamily. And another characteristic of San Francisco, which I think is similar to a lot of international cities, is that a majority of our residents live in multifamily buildings and apartment buildings, about 2/3. So we wanted to make sure we go after apartment buildings, otherwise we're missing most of the residential food scraps. But there, it's more challenging. So that's why we didn't do that at first. We did the easier, low-hanging fruit, made that program successful, and then came back to the apartment buildings. And that's an example of the signage there. We want people to put both their food prep, pre-consumer, but also their food scrapings, their post-scrapings. And we give examples of how they can collect the food. Every resident, every household, that is, gets a kitchen pail. That's a designated pail to help them separate out their food scraps. We've tried different pails. That's the one that we currently use in the middle there, the Sure Close bin, nicely designed so that you can scrape off the full plate. But we also say that you can use newspaper or cartons or compostable bags or paper bags, many different options. If they want to use a compostable bag, they have to pay for that. We don't provide it. That's an option. I know there are communities in Europe, for example, that provide compostable bags, and that does have a benefit for high participation, but we haven't wanted to get into that cost. One of the challenges in working with apartment buildings, we have many old buildings that have chutes, and that makes it challenging because a principle of our program is to make it as convenient as possible. And so if everybody can throw their trash down the chute and they have to walk their compostables down the stairs, that's not equally convenient. It makes it hard. So what we try to do is say, don't use a chute, or right next to the chute, put a container for composting and recycling that maybe the building management brings down to the loading dock. And so a key aspect of implementing our program is providing, as I said, everybody kitchen pails. There's an example of another one we tried. Direct, face-to-face, door-to-door communication, outreach is key. And even in a city the size of San Francisco, it's worth making that initial investment when you're rolling out a program. You give an opportunity to have that face-to-face contact. You don't meet everybody, but you do as much as you can. So that's a key part of our strategy, is face-to-face. In addition to the multifamily buildings, well, let me just say, going back for a second on the multifamily. So the single-family residence we pick up just once per week, but the multifamily we typically pick up 2 or 3 times a week. We had the example of Rosario doing it 3 times a week. Multiple times a week has the advantage of being able to collect more convenient, but there is a higher cost. But with space constraints, we do need to go there typically more than once a week. Then on the commercial side, we also rolled that out. We started with the wholesale produce market back 20 years ago, and then we went to retail, then we went to large food service, and then smaller food service, and then eventually we went beyond food establishments and we went to office buildings and other commercial establishments. And with the commercial, many different container sizes and many different, much frequency, sometimes from once a week to every day. And for a food establishment, we would go and they might have a large container or a compactor for their trash, and we would say most of what you are throwing away is compostable, food scraps and other organic material. So why don't we take your large container and flip it from being a trash landfill container to being a composting container, and then we would paint it green to help make the color-coded connection. So many different types of bins. This is a very common bin, cubic yard bin, that one a 2 cubic yard bin, picked up by front-loader trucks, different types of dedicated trucks picking up the compostables. So when we rolled out the composting program on the commercial side, we started with back-of-the-house food prep. As you heard in the examples earlier, that's where you have more of, a higher level of control of the business, and that's where they often generate the most food waste. It does depend on the type of food establishment. But here you see example of green for composting, gray for trash, blue for recycling, all next to each other in these 20-gallon, 80-liter bins, Slim Jim size, very, very convenient to sort the food waste. But good, effective, convenient implementation and training to make it example. Here they're putting it into larger bins that can be wheeled out and directly tipped into a truck. Those smaller ones have to be tipped into another container. So we focus on back of the house, but eventually we want to even be able to get to the front of the house. That's more difficult because that's where the public's interfacing and you're asking for the public behavior to sort this material. But here's an example where we want to do good, effective communication signage, customizing the signage with the specific products that establishment's doing. This is a fast casual food. I don't know if anybody can see what the brand is, but it's Burger King, which I think we have worldwide, right? So here they've done where they say, okay, all the plastics we're going to recycle because we accept all rigid plastics for recycling, all the paper and food, composting, and then certain products we can't compost or recycle will go in the landfill bin. We are expanding our program actually, so some of those will be recycling soon. Here's another example below. It's the San Francisco hospital, where you'll see that a bunch of stations for putting materials, most of it is green because most of what they're discarding is compostables. And here you have not only the pictures, but you actually have 3-dimensional real objects posted there. So to help make it even more real, easier to identify what's going in composting and recycling. Here's an example of an office building with the compostables, recyclables, and trash. What we found with office building is once we removed the paper and bottles and cans for recycling, which we did first, most of what was left over is actually compostable. A lot of people are eating their lunch in their office buildings. And then you go into the restrooms where they have paper towels. Paper towels are compostable. You might say, well, aren't they recyclable? Yeah, but with the short paper fiber and them getting wet and soiled, they're not very good for recycling, better to composting. And because it's all virtually paper towel, we just put a little sticker there saying this is going to composting. Don't put anything that's not a paper towel there. Sanitary products, maybe you have a container in the stalls. So with our commercial establishments and institutions like city agencies, we have a whole strategy where we do audits, we do in-person presentations, multilingual training. I contract with a team of people that are out there working with many businesses at all times of day, at all times of shifts, setting up convenient operations, auditing, presentations, monitoring, upfront investment to make an effective separation. Here's an example of a large operation where they have a loading dock with large green bin for composting, blue bin for recycling, trash, and maybe even they have the ability to do some quality control sorting at the loading dock. We also work with our school systems. We've gotten all the schools to have composting and recycling, the several hundred schools across the city. And when you teach the kids, they help teach the parents. Special events used to be one of the hardest places, public fairs, concerts, marches, festivals. Used to be very hard to do recycling, but once we had the composting program and were able to get them to use compostables, good signage. The best system is when you have somebody there to remind people where to put it, and even better when you pay people to help back of the house do some cleanup sorting. And special events will now make that investment because they can save a lot, and I'll get to that. People have an opportunity to customize their signage. We can do that on their web, putting specific reasons. Other outreach, we have newsletter promoting all the benefits of composting. Various campaigns from bus shelters, all different types of signage, web campaigns. We have a new campaign called Compost for Foodies. It's a web-based campaign for millennials. If I had the time, I'd play the video, but I won't take the time. But we make different connections. Here we're making the connection to climate. Here we're talking about community gardens. Here, this is for the Chinese community, a little jiu-jitsu. You know, you flip your food waste and you help grow food. And our biggest, with all those campaigns and how clever we can be, we feel like the most effective way when you're communicating to people is to be able to talk to people face to face. So we actually have a team from different neighborhoods that speak different languages that can go out and work door to door. So one of the things that makes this program a success is that we have a pay-as-you-throw system where people pay based on their service volume. We like to talk about like a utility, because our private service provider actually is sort of like utility. They're a protected monopoly in the city, a long-term legal system, and we regulate them by setting the rates that they charge. And they charge, again, by volume. And then they also have, and we actually give them incentives so they can achieve goals by reducing tons to landfill. They achieve a higher profit margin. You can do that through contracts, but it's a little trickier. So I think this is a key ingredient for successful programs, and provides the good financial incentive. Dedicated collection, we use these trucks for a lot of the narrow, tight streets. Side-loading hoppers allow you to look in. It goes to a dedicated transfer station, and then it goes to the compost facility. So the stuff that we're collecting 650 to 700 tons a day of compostables. About 20% is from our residential single family, 5% from apartments. It's probably a little bit more apartments now, but that's approximate. They don't generate quite as much food. Also, this includes the plant debris from yards, so that's why residential is higher. But about 3/4 is from our commercial. We have 5,000 food establishments, and overall, about 3/4 of all the waste generated in the city is actually from the commercial sector. And about 2/3 of it, this is food scraps. So we're looking at, we're recovering over 400 tons of food scraps every day. And our contamination rate is manageable. 2 to 5% requires processing at the facility. It's gone up a little bit as we've squeezed it by getting everybody on board. Really quickly, many different ways to do composting. In the United States, you'll see almost all composting facilities are outdoor facilities, turn piles, windrow piles. When you're getting into dealing with a lot of food, it can be a little bit more challenging just to do a turn windrow, but especially if you get to a point where you're doing almost 1 part food to 1 part yard trimmings. So what we've evolved to like 4 different generations here, but basically these are piles that have air blown through them. Really quickly, how the process works: material is tipped, shredded, goes through a screen, a sorting station, pulling out some contaminants. Mostly plastic is the primary contaminant. We make piles over pipes, and air is blown through these. It's called forced aeration. Mostly air is being pulled through the pile, negative aeration, for 30 days, and we actually turn this every 10 days, going to smaller pipes. The first 10 days gets the most air, and then it goes through these pipes and through this biofilter. This is a very common odor control process that reduces odor and volatile organics and methane by way over 90%, 95%. And it's basically hardwood chips that are maintained with a moisture level, and it's another biological process. Material is screened, and we actually take a screen fraction, a middle fraction from 3/8 to 1.5 inches, and put it over the active piles to act as kind of a bio-cover filter that allows, if there's any air that backflows, and it can allow the air to go both directions. After the 30 days of blowing air through the pile, we do 30 days of turning. And after that 60-day process, we end up with a really high-quality compost. And this compost is custom blended for a variety of growers. We have soil scientists that work with growers, help identify not just the compost they want, but other ingredients to meet a full recipe of beneficial properties, mixing in things like gypsum and sawdust. And we do landscaping, golf courses, but the biggest uses and the biggest benefit that we're excited about is going to agriculture, both for produce, but primarily for row crops, vineyards, and fruit and nut orchards. And with the vineyards, for example, well, the fruit and nut orchards, we get really great-looking fruit from the process. This is a really biologically rich, nutrient-rich, with physical, chemical, and biological benefits. And here's an interesting example of compost use. So when you think about vineyards, putting compost, you might just think helping to directly grow the grapes by putting it at the base of the grapes. That has a benefit. Actually, an even bigger benefit is to spread it between rows to help grow cover crops. Here you see the cover crop growing, and here you see it growing even higher. So here the cover crop is grown up. In this case, it's a mustard plant. And these plants are really good because they're nitrogen-fixing cover crop. They pull nitrogen from the atmosphere, they pull carbon from the atmosphere, and they improve the soil, the healthy soil, to grow healthier, better-tasting, rich crops. Very exciting research has been done around the benefits of compost, particularly with regards to carbon sequestration and climate change. And some of the most extensive research has been done in California. This is north of San Francisco in Marin. These squares here, rectangles, are hectare plots. They put a 1/2 inch, which is, just this much. I forget how many centimeters that is. 2.5 centimeters, maybe, if not even that. They put a 1/2 inch of compost apply it just one time, and then they monitor every year how much more plant growth, how much water savings in the soil, how much more carbon, and they find that we get significant moisture retention, significant plant growth, and significant carbon storage. So every year after that application, we saw an additional ton of carbon per hectare. And when they look at this, and it's also with good management, of course, with using livestock, but when they looked at that and they said, well, okay, we can do this if we did this for 5% of the rangeland in California, we would offset all the agricultural emissions in California, and California is a very big agricultural state. So we're talking about millions of tons of carbon offset through that. So the whole concept of carbon farming is something that is taking off in California, and compost use is a key ingredient. So with the use of taking food scraps and composting it, we have an opportunity to return the carbon and nutrient back to the soil and creating a loop of collection, processing, back to the soil, and then that food comes back to the city, the food, the wine, and really it's closing the loop. And you can do it locally, right in your city, especially with community gardens, local farms. We're doing it regionally, and there's just a lot of benefit from that. I just want to touch policy-wise. This program was voluntary with good financial incentives and outreach, and we made it mandatory 7 years ago. And with making it mandatory, we basically said everybody has to do it. Everybody has to separate out their food scraps along with other compostables and recyclables. Nobody can mix it, and we'll violate you. We can potentially violate you if you don't do that. And we require property managers, multi-family, multi-tenant office buildings to provide the service to their tenants, because that was one of the problems. Many tenants didn't have the opportunity to participate because the building manager just didn't want to bother putting in the system. So we've done that. We've put the system in, and now, and we provide lots of assistance. Now we can make sure they're doing it by checking out their trash, auditing it, giving people direct feedback. And with that, I just want to give you the illustration of the power of having a policy like mandatory that you use as an outreach tool and enforce. Look at how that line just jumps right up. And so we went from having around 2,000 apartment buildings with the service now to almost 9,000. And we basically have virtually all apartment buildings with the composting program. And with the commercial, you also see it taking off, both at the time of mandatory. And the blue line, which shows that we have about 13,000 commercial accounts, from individual restaurants to large shopping centers on the composting program. The red line shows that virtually everybody is compliant. There are some small businesses that don't need composting because they have no food scraps. So the result is that we now have 99% of all our locations, all our properties, we consider compliant in having food composting along with recycling. And that's resulted in getting the whole city doing it. And this shows you how the growth in composting tonnage has taken off with mandatory. And as I said before, we're up around 650 to 700 tons, really around 700 tons, most of that being food scraps. So just to close here, what are the lessons that we've learned? Well, providing comprehensive service is really important. And that we did that partly based on creating pilot programs to test it out. And then doing the outreach, providing multilingual outreach, multilingual training, face-to-face, providing financial incentives. If you have a pay-as-you-throw system, you can do that. And ours is not as sophisticated as using RFIDs. We've looked at that. That's quite expensive. So we don't weigh each container. It's just based on the service volume. But it gives businesses and residences to reduce their service or change it to save money. Working to get management commitment, mandating separation, auditing and giving feedback, compliance with penalties, and then just keep persisting and seeing all the benefits with creating healthy food, with reducing fertilizer and pesticide and irrigation use, climate benefits. All of that can be emphasized and integrated with the other food recovery efforts. So as I said, I'm guessing that we're recovering about 3/4 of all our food scraps. That's a lot, but we still have food going into the trash. And I think we will as long as we have a trash stream. But we want to do more outreach and enforcement to get better source separation. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to encouraging people to have smaller trash service and more recycling, composting service as needed. So we're about to roll out a program next year. We're going to be giving automatically people smaller bins, because our average family household has about a 120-liter, 32-gallon bin, which actually is small for the U.S. But given that 90% of what people discard can be composted or recycled, there's no reason for people to have a 120-liter bin. So why don't we give them a smaller bin? And what we're going for is a 16-gallon bin. So what is that? 16-gallon, 64-liter. So we're going to reduce it by about half. The other thing that we're doing is, because we are going for zero waste, we want to recover as much as possible, and we have good stuff left in the trash, we have been experimenting with different technologies to separate the residual trash stream to recover organics as well as recyclables. And we've been testing different technologies out. We're currently using a press from Europe that squeezes the kind of squeezable food out of the mixed trash and results in a pretty clean stream. Now, once we recover stuff from trash, and this is sort of like the MBT composting, mixed waste composting, you don't have inherently as clean a food product. And that's why my primary message, one of the primary takeaways here is, even though it can seem very challenging, it's worth to invest in a source-separated food composting program. You can produce high-quality food-based compost and that with the benefits of going into food. But then it's also worth looking eventually at recovering food out of the mixed stream, but then it's not going to be as high value. So what we're going to do with that is we're digesting that for biogas. That's being done at a regional wastewater treatment plant. And we'll squeeze all the energy we can out of it first, and then the residual will be stabilized for land application. We could do that with source-separated food scraps, because for pure food scraps, I think digestion and composting is ideal, but that's more expensive. So there's a balance of costs, and it's really not about AD or composting. It's about composting or AD and composting, because if you do AD only, you have a lot of residual that you need to stabilize. And in terms of investment priority, I would invest in composting first, and then maybe add the composting. And I'm going to be on time, because that was my last slide. Well, second to last slide. I finally just want to emphasize, I cannot overemphasize the climate connection, and I've been glad to hear that connection being made. And Jacques has some really impressive number there for the food recovery on climate. So this is our climate strategy. We have one of the most aggressive strategies as a city in the US, but really only over the last couple of years have we reframed our climate strategy with this message: 0, 50, 100 roots. 0 is about going to zero waste, and so a key part of that is the food composting. 50 is about sustainable transportation, 50% of all trips being sustainable, 100% renewable electricity. But then we added this thing called roots. Any idea what the roots is? This is just to see how well you've been listening. Yes, and it's carbon farming. It's really about, well, if we were to turn off all the carbon emissions right now, we're at 400 parts per million. That's too high, right? We need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. We don't want to rely on risky geoengineering schemes. The most safe way is to put it back in the soil, and the soils worldwide have the potential to take all that extra carbon and more, and in fact, by taking it in, they're going to become healthier, better for producing food. And so how do you do that? Well, just having more trees, more plants, but using compost to really help trigger the soil system to be optimal in that way. And that's my presentation. Thank you.